Welcome back to the channel. It's the Fantasy Football Strategist here. As promised, I am bringing top 24 quarterback rankings today. I'll have top 36 wide receivers and running backs, as well as the top 24 tight ends for 2024, releasing this week. Please like and subscribe. And to begin, we have Will Levis of the Tennessee Titans. So he's 6'4", 229 pounds. He was drafted in the second round, second overall this past season. He is 25.1 years old. So he was a little bit older for a rookie, but when he came in the first game of this past season, he absolutely dominated. He had 4 touchdowns with no interceptions. DeAndre Hopkins went off. Things looked really, really good for him. Then he did kind of trail off this past season. Well, they didn't really have the best team around him. They did have Derrick Henry. Hopkins is getting older. Treylon Burks was injured the majority of the time. Okonkwo was decent. He started breaking out towards the latter half of the season and the final quarter of the season anyways. Well, they added Calvin Ridley in the draft and they signed Tony Pollard. So I think this is going to provide a better running game for them and then obviously an additional receiving option. By the way, they also signed Tyler Boyd to man the slot. It's looking like Burks is the odd man out here. I would like to have Will Levis higher than 24th overall, but he just doesn't provide any rushing upside, or at least he didn't this past season, which is a little bit surprising because during college he regularly ran the ball, at least scrambled, and he did have some designed runs. He's more of a powerful runner than a finesse runner. But just because I don't really see the max upside of being, for instance, a quarterback one due to essentially there being no rushing upside, I have him down here at QB 24. He also has a new head coach in Brian Callahan. He was the former offensive coordinator for the Cincinnati Bengals, so at least he does have an offensive-minded head coach in this season. I will say, though, his 10.1 air yards per attempt were first in the NFL, so he does have a very, very good arm, and he does like to stretch the field deep. So now that he has a vertical option in Calvin Ridley to help make DeAndre Hopkins be more of a possession receiver, I think this offense is going to look a lot better than it did this past season. At QB 23, I have Matthew Stafford of the Los Angeles Rams. So he's 6'2", 225 pounds. He is 36.5 years old, so he is advanced in age. He has a very good situation around him. His running back situation, at least to take the pressure off of him, is Kyren Williams, and they did draft Blake Corum, so they should have a solid running game. Then they have Cooper Kupp, who admittedly is a little bit older, but he was very effective in his win rate versus man and just overall in general. Then obviously Puka Nacua took the league by storm this past season, finished as the wide receiver 4. So he has 2 solid options in the passing game at receiver. The offense is generally going to funnel through them. Now, he has finished as the quarterback 10 and 11 in points per game in 2 of the past 3 seasons. I just think he's going to regress just a little bit here, and he just doesn't really offer the upside to be a QB1 consistently because he just does not run the ball at all, given his age. He never really has, though. But he's a very safe floor quarterback because the offense is going to be among the leaders in points per game this season, so he's more of a QB2 for you than a QB1 unless, like this past season, a ton of quarterbacks get hurt. But you can generally get him later in drafts, and he is a very safe quarterback. At QB 22, I have Kirk Cousins, and he's the final quarterback in this tier. So he's 6'3", 214 pounds. He's 36 years old. He is coming off an Achilles tear this past season, so we'll have to see about his health. But he does find himself in a very fantasy-friendly situation, just like he had in Minnesota. He's going to have star running back Bijan Robinson. Kyle Pitts is another year removed from his terrible knee injury. I do expect him to be a very, very high tight end this season. Then they have Drake London, so he does have the framework of elite offensive playmakers around him. They signed Darnell Mooney as well. So really, he finds himself in essentially a very good situation, and his offensive line, by the way, is very good. Now, he has finished right around the QB 11 to 10 in fantasy points per game the past couple seasons. I just don't see the upside with him, so while you're generally getting a safe player just like with Matt Stafford, the upside to be a high-end QB1 just isn't there because he's just not going to run the ball at all. I'd be surprised if he had more than 75 rushing yards this season, coming off the injury especially. And so he's just more of a safe quarterback than an overall upside quarterback. So in the next tier, we have Daniel Jones, Baker Mayfield, and Aaron Rodgers. So at QB 21, we have Daniel Jones of the New York Giants. He's 6'5", 221 pounds. He's 27.2 years old. This is a make-or-break year for Daniel Jones. His roster is rather barren around him. I do like rookie tight end Theo Johnson in this offense, but it's hard to expect a rookie tight end to really produce anything. We've been really lucky with the likes of Kyle Pitts, Sam Laporta, and Kincaid as of recently. But then they also did draft Malik Neighbors, so he does have what projects to be a star wide receiver 1. But besides that, Wan'Dale Robinson, they have a very poor offensive line. He does provide, however, rushing upside. He did finish as the QB 10 in fantasy points per game 2 seasons ago. So there is some upside here. It's just the situation is rather bleak. And coming off an injury, I'm not sure what his rushing is going to look like. So he does have some upside, but his lows are extremely low. He's a much better fantasy quarterback than a real-life quarterback, and unfortunately, I think that's going to hurt his job security in the future. But for 2024 fantasy football, I'm just very wary of the situation around him, and I wouldn't really be shocked if he was pulled, because even though 2 seasons ago he had a QB 10 fantasy points per game finish, he's been very inconsistent, and that's why I have him down here, because it's very boom or bust for him from a week-to-week basis. So at QB 20, I have Baker Mayfield of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. He just received an extension. He did, however, lose Dave Canales. I think that was some of the driver behind his QB 17 finish in fantasy points per game, so I do bump him down just a little bit. He's 6'1", 215 pounds, and 29.3 years old. He finds himself in, admittedly, a relatively good situation. He has ex-wide receiver Mike Evans. Chris Godwin's going to move back to the slot. They have either Trey Palmer or Jalen McMillan to man the Z position. Tight end Cade Otton's fine as well. He did start to break out in the playoffs, so we'll see about that. Tristan Wirfs is a fine tackle, so his offensive line, and Ryan Jensen is very good as well. So he does have a solid offensive line. He just doesn't provide you with really any rushing upside, so I have him down at QB 20. All these guys down here are guys that are just probably not going to be QB 1s. It's just some of these guys I find safer than others. So if you did have a QB 2, for instance, if you are in a Superflex redraft league this season, these guys are fantastic QB 2s or preferably QB 3s for you. And you're in good hands because they're going to be very safe in terms of their floor. It's just that their ceiling on a week-to-week basis is just a little bit limited. At QB 19, I have Aaron Rodgers of the New York Jets. So at 6'2", 223 pounds, and at 40.7 years old, he is obviously older, but he's a Hall of Famer. The thing is, I think he's going to be extremely motivated to prove the doubters wrong and have a very good season. Let's face the music, though. At 40.7 years old, he's probably not going to provide you with much rushing upside for his own good anyways, coming off an Achilles tear. He does find himself in a relatively fantasy-friendly situation, though. It's not as if he doesn't have any playmakers around him. Garrett Wilson is a very, very good receiver, an elite receiver in terms of actual talent. He just, with Zach Wilson, hasn't been able to show that. They also have Breece Hall, who, in my opinion, is the best or second best back in the league, but that's not what this is about. He has a very good situation. They have Mike Williams coming in, for instance. We'll see, coming off an ACL tear, if he can return to form and stay healthy. They drafted Malachi Corley to play the slot. He's been compared to a baby Deebo Samuel. He's very good after the catch, breaks tackles. So all in all, he should have solid playmakers around him. He also has Conklin at tight end. They made big efforts to invest in the tackle position with Morgan Moses, drafting Olu Fashanu, signing Tyron Smith from the Cowboys formerly. So overall, he does have a very good situation around him. Without the rushing upside, I think maybe QB 15 to 14 is probably his max ceiling this season. So in the D tier, Deshun Watson is the only quarterback here. Now, he theoretically has the upside to be a QB1 and an elite QB1. In fact, in 2020, he was the QB5 overall. Then he had the allegations and things like that. Then this past season and the season before that, he's been hurt, so he hasn't really been able to show the upside. So this is kind of a risky pick, but it does present you with a lot of theoretical upside. If he can just stay healthy, he has David Njoku at tight end. He has Amari Cooper at wide receiver. They traded for Jerry Jeudy. We'll see if he ends up being able to do anything. They might have Nick Chubb. We'll see about his health. Jerome Ford. So he does have solid playmakers around him. The offensive line isn't the best, but it's not the worst either. So he is a player at QB 18 that does present you with a very large amount of upside. It's just risky because for 3 seasons now we haven't seen it. So in the C tier we have Tua Tagovailoa, Jared Goff, and Justin Herbert. These are all players that I do feel comfortable with their floor. I just think their ceiling is going to be a little bit limited. So with Tua, he just received an extension. He has one of the best situations imaginable around him with Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle. They even have Jonnu Smith at tight end now, Odell Beckham Jr., then Devon Achane, Jalen Wright, and Raheem Mostert at running back. Admittedly, the interior offensive line is a little bit weak, but overall it's a very good situation. I just think that the upside for him isn't there. Essentially, he led the league in passing, for instance, this past season, and he was the QB9. That's just not likely to happen year over year, and his upside is extremely limited because he just does not run in any way, shape, or form. He represents basically the lowest possible upside in terms of rushing the ball of just about anybody. So while he is a very safe quarterback, he just is never going to be the QB1 overall. In fact, this past season finishing as the QB9, that took multiple quarterback injuries for that to happen. So I think in my rankings, having him as QB17 is pretty fair. He does have the upside to finish a little bit higher than this, but he's just never going to be an elite QB1. Therefore, I'd much rather draft for upside than draft for a player that's probably pretty good. At QB16, I have Jared Goff of the Detroit Lions. So, yes, while he did finish as a QB7, he's more of a low teens type of quarterback in all reality. He has finished as a QB10 and 7 the past 2 seasons, but I think this past season especially was just due to injuries at the top half of the league among the quarterback position, at least in regards to fantasy. He's 6'4", 215 pounds, and is 29.8 years old. He just signed an extension with the Lions. It is admittedly the perfect situation for Jared Goff. They have David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs in the backfield. That's awesome. Sam Laporta flashed as a rookie tight end, finished as the tight end 1. They have Amon-Ra St. Brown and Jamison Williams. Amon-Ra St. Brown's going to eat underneath. J-Mo's going to stretch the defense. And they do have, in my opinion, the best offensive line in the NFL. So it's a very positive situation in regards to being conducive to fantasy success. It's just, once again, I think this past season, it took a bunch of injuries for him to finish as a QB7. Just like with Tua, he's a very safe quarterback. It's just his max upside. He's just never going to be the QB1 overall. Now, one thing to consider, he does play almost every game this season in a dome, and his dome versus non-dome splits are massive. So there is a little bit more upside than there would be normally because of that. So I think his QB16 valuation here is very fair. It wouldn't shock me if he finished a little bit higher than that, but it would shock me if he finished as an elite QB1 this year. It would take a bunch of injuries. So at QB16, you're getting a very safe player that is almost never going to lose you your week in fantasy. At QB15, I have Justin Herbert of the Los Angeles Chargers, standing at 6'6", 236 pounds, and being 26.4 years old. He is one of those players that is just going to be a victim of his situation. Now, I think people are overreacting a little bit to his coaching changes. Jim Harbaugh is not very fantasy friendly. Greg Roman is really the problem here. As a Ravens fan, trust me. Justin Herbert is just not Lamar Jackson, and Greg Roman in general has just never led a massive passing attack by any means. He's very uncreative in the pass game. He's very creative in the run game. It's just that Justin Herbert, once again, isn't Lamar Jackson. So while he has finished as the QB2 and QB8 in 2 of the past 3 seasons in fantasy points per game, I think his ceiling is massively limited. They got rid of Keenan Allen and Mike Williams. They did draft Lad McConkey. It's just his situation is, and they lost Austin Eckler as well. So really, with J.K. Dobbins and Gus Edwards in the backfield, they're going to run. Kamani Vidal is a good rookie sleeper as well at running back. But I think Justin Herbert's ceiling just isn't there, even though in real life terms he is a very, very good, if not potentially elite quarterback. He's going to be a very safe player from week to week. I just think his ceiling has been lowered massively with this Greg Roman signing. The next tier consists of Brock Purdy, Jordan Love, Trevor Lawrence, and Joe Burrow. Now, all of these guys are players that I could absolutely see finishing as QB1s. I just don't see any way that they'll be the QB1 overall. That's how I view this tier in general. So, Brock Purdy, he's in a fantastic situation. The left side of his offensive line is better than the right. He has a fantastic tight end in the aging George Kittle. He has Deebo Samuel at wide receiver. He might have Brandon Ayuk. The latest news I've heard is that they're potentially in talks with Brandon Ayuk again, so if he gets extended, that's wonderful for Brock Purdy. They drafted Ricky Pearsall. He can play either Deebo Samuel or Brandon Ayuk's role. Then they have Christian McCaffrey. They drafted Isaac Guerendo. So overall, his skill position players are absolutely elite. The reason I have Brock Purdy down here is while he did finish as a QB6 with the QB6 fantasy points per game, once again, as I've mentioned earlier, there were several elite quarterbacks that were hurt, so that did help his fantasy finish just a little bit. And really, it's just that he doesn't have much rushing upside, so it's going to take extreme efficiency, which is very possible because Kyle Shanahan's a fantastic head coach, but he's going to have to be among the league leaders in passing yards and touchdowns in general to finish as a QB1. And he'll just likely never be the QB1 or in the top 5 generally when there aren't injuries to top quarterbacks. So I think that his QB14 valuation here is very fair, and you're getting a player with a lot of week-to-week potential upside and a very safe floor. I just think that his max upside is just not what some of the players in the next two tiers are going to be. At QB13, we have Jordan Love of the Green Bay Packers, so he is coming off the QB5 overall and points per game finish. I do think that was his absolute ceiling because he's going to have to generally lead the league in passing yards and touchdowns or be among the leaders there to have a repeat finish. And once again, multiple starting quarterbacks that would have probably finished ahead of him were hurt, which I think just like him and Jared Goff and Brock Purdy inflated his overall finish just a little bit. But he's a very, very good real-life quarterback. He has solid playmakers around him in Dontavian Wicks, Romeo Doubs, Christian Watson, Jaden Reed, Luke Musgrave, Tucker Kraft. They did, however, sign Josh Jacobs in free agency, so I do think they're going to be a little bit more run-heavy than they were this past season. But with LaFleur in town, it's a wonderful scheme, the Shanahan scheme, just like Brock Purdy has. I just think that his overall finish was a little bit inflated, but he absolutely could be a QB1. He could be a top 12 quarterback again. In fact, being 13th, that's right around that range. I just don't foresee a QB5 finish again. Therefore, I think his QB13 valuation here is fair. At QB12, I have Trevor Lawrence of the Jacksonville Jaguars. So he's 6'6", 220 pounds, and 24.8 years old. Everyone thought he was going to be the next coming of Andrew Luck. Now, he has not lived up to those standards, but I will say in his rookie year, he had Urban Meyer as his head coach. ETN, his running back, was hurt. He had Christian Kirk, and yeah. So I think that wasn't fair to him, but he's finished as a QB 13 and 12 in fantasy points per game the past 2 seasons. So I think his QB12 valuation is very fair, and I do think he takes the leap this year, and he could finish as right around the 10th best quarterback. I think that with them drafting Brian Thomas, that's the vertical threat that he's desperately needed to show off his massive throwing power. They also signed Gabe Davis, so that was a little bit redundant, but now he has 2 vertical threats in the passing game. He'll have Christian Kirk to work over the middle of the field and vertically somewhat, and he'll have Evan Ingram underneath to utilize his run-after-catch ability, and ETN in the backfield, who's an underrated receiver. So overall, it's a very, very good situation. His offensive line should be a little bit healthier. And overall, I could see him finishing right around the QB 10. He has shown massive upside in certain weeks. He just hasn't quite put it together yet. But I do think he has a little bit more rushing upside than some of the quarterbacks below him, with the exception of maybe Jordan Love, Deshun Watson, and maybe Daniel Jones. But overall, I think he is going to take the step up, and I think he's going to finish right around the QB 10 to 12 this season. And at QB 11, and the final player in this tier, we have Joe Burrow of the Cincinnati Bengals. So he's 6'4", 221, and 27.6 years old. He is in a solid situation with wide receiver Jamar Chase and T. Higgins, at least for one more year with Higgins. They drafted Jermaine Burton. There had been some early buzz at camp, but we haven't really seen too much. He actually did score a touchdown in this preseason game. They did lose Joe Mixon. They signed Zach Moss, and they still have Chase Brown in the running back room. It's fine. They have Mike Gesicki as well at tight end. He used to be really good. I don't know what's happened. His career's kind of trailed off. But before this past season, Joe Burrow was the QB 10 and 4 in fantasy points per game. It's just that he really doesn't provide you with any rushing upside at all, really. And basically all of the quarterbacks that are going to be ahead of him have way more rushing upside, which I think just maximizes their potential ceiling. And so I think Joe Burrow is the final of these quarterbacks that is more than likely never going to be the QB1 overall or generally be in the top 5. But he absolutely has the ability to finish as a QB1 and around the QB 8 to 12 in terms of his overall fantasy finish. So the A tier consists of Jaden Daniels, Caleb Williams, CJ Stroud, Kyler Murray, and Dak Prescott. So at QB 10 we have Jaden Daniels. He's 6'4", 210 pounds, and at 23.6 years old, he is a little bit older for being a rookie quarterback, just like Will Levis was this past season. I will say, in his first rookie game, he threw a beautiful ball on a streak to the right side of the field for about 40 yards. Then he did have a rushing touchdown on a zone read option. I will say, though, he missed a wide-open screen pass by over 5 yards, so it looks like essentially everything we thought about him in terms of struggling to make the easy throws and then having elite accuracy and touch on the difficult throws is coming to fruition here. I will say, though, he has the theoretical rushing upside to finish as the QB1 overall. It's just you are taking a risk if you were to draft Jaden Daniels anywhere close to there, so I do think he's a very good value. He's going around QB 15 off the board in redraft, which is, I think, a very good value. As I said, he possesses massive rushing upside. He's kind of like a Kyler Murray in that regard, just a little bit unproven. His situation with Terry McLaurin being his wide receiver 1 is good. I do like Ben Sinnott as rookie tight end. We'll see if he produces as a rookie. Jahan Dotson's okay. Overall, and the offensive line, by the way, is just atrocious. So I do worry a little bit about Jaden Daniels, but at QB 15, you could be getting potentially the QB1 if he's able to stay healthy and have a relatively good season in terms of his total touchdowns. At QB 9, I have Caleb Williams of the Chicago Bears. He's 6'1", 214 pounds, and he's 22.7 years old. Just like with Jaden Daniels, we saw a lot of good from him in his first action in the preseason. He rushed for a first down when nothing was open, didn't force anything. He threw a strike to DJ Moore to convert a third down. He hit Cole Kmet on a PA boot about 27 yards down the field. He threw a masterful pass to DeAndre Swift where he had to wrap his arm around a defender to get it done. He excels at basically anything he does. The issues with playing hero ball were because he knew his defense was going to be giving up 50 points a game, and if he didn't score 50-plus points a game, he didn't have a shot. He didn't display any of those tendencies in his first action as a rookie, and if it was to happen, I would think that's when it would happen, so I'm really not worried about that. His situation is about as good as it gets. He has DeAndre Swift in the running back room. He's a very good pass-catching running back. Then he has Cole Kmet and Gerald Everett as his 2 pass-catching tight ends. That's really good. He has 3 wide receiver 1s in Rome Odunze, DJ Moore, and Keenan Allen. And he has a solid offensive line, and especially his 2 tackles are pretty good in pass protection. So overall, He is absolutely set up for success, and he does have the rushing upside. In fact, in 2 of his 3 collegiate seasons, he had 10 or more rushing touchdowns. So he does have the ability to finish as a QB1 overall, even though I would project him to be probably a mid to low end QB1. But make no mistake, he could finish as a QB1 overall, and in the future, he's going to go much higher in redraft and dynasty leagues. So at QB8, I have CJ Stroud of the Houston Texans. Obviously, these are tiered rankings, so anyone in any individual tier you could swap out for another, and I'd have no issue with it. Obviously, we like what we saw from CJ Stroud. He's 6'3", 214 pounds, and at 22.8 years old, he has not even remotely touched his ceiling. They have Nico Collins to play X, Diggs to play Z, and Tank Dell to play the Y, so he has 3 stud receivers. Dalton Schultz is a fine tight end. They brought in Joe Mixon, so I think they will run the ball a little bit more than they did this past season, which I do think lowers his ceiling. But he did finish as a QB11 this past season, and while I don't think he's going to be the QB1 overall, it's theoretically within his range of outcomes. He would have to have a 2018 or 2022 Patrick Mahomes type of season, but he did finish with the 7th most fantasy points per game and finished as a QB11 as a rookie. And it's reasonable to project some growth, and he's going to be a very, very safe player with the potential for a 30 or 40-point game if he gets into a shootout type of game. My QB7 is Kyler Murray of the Arizona Cardinals. So fun fact about Kyler Murray, despite his QB27 finish, if you took his points per game average, he would have finished as the QB6 in fantasy. He presents you with massive rushing upside, but people have forgotten about that because he tore his ACL 2 years ago, so he only played half a season, and then he came back at the end of the season, and he played about 8 games this past season. Now, he was the QB6 in fantasy points per game, and what did they do? Well, they didn't lose anybody, but they did draft Marvin Harrison Jr., who's going to fill the old DeAndre Hopkins role. They still have Trey McBride, and they drafted Trey Benson to eventually take over James Conner's role. So he's going to have a stable running game, and he's going to have a dominant X receiver that has absolute positional versatility, but is generally going to play X for them, and a stud tight end. So I think he absolutely could finish as a QB1 overall, even though I wouldn't per se bet on it. But in a previous video of mine, he is my dark horse candidate to be the QB1 overall. So the final player in this A tier is Dak Prescott of the Dallas Cowboys. This past season, he finished as the QB3 with the 4th most fantasy points per game. I do think that was a little bit aided by the fact that some of the top quarterbacks were hurt, but at 6'2", 226 pounds, and being 31 years old, he still does offer some rushing upside. For instance, he had 242 this past season. He has, however, since his injury in 2020, not been the rushing threat that we've come to know and love. But his situation is relatively the same. Now, CeeDee Lamb is holding out as of now, so this will massively hinge on whether or not CeeDee Lamb is back. I do expect him to play this season. I doubt he holds out the entire year. But if he does hold out, Dak Prescott is going way down in these rankings. His offensive line is going to be a little bit worse this year. They lost Tyron Smith. They brought back Zeke Elliott, so the running game isn't going to be quite as potent, in my opinion, as it was. Rico Dowdle's more likely to be the leader in fantasy points, at least from the running back room. But he does offer a very, very high weekly ceiling, but he's a very streaky player. But make no mistake, he does have the theoretical upside to be the QB1 overall. I just don't see it being quite as likely, which is why he's in these tier of quarterbacks that could finish as the QB1 overall. I just wouldn't bet on it. So the S tier consists of Anthony Richardson, Lamar Jackson, Pat Mahomes, Jaylen Herz, and Josh Allen. At QB5, I have Anthony Richardson of the Indianapolis Colts. Fun fact, his 0.73 fantasy points per dropback were first in the NFL among quarterbacks with at least 90 snaps. And he's in a wonderful situation with Shane Steichen as his play caller. He is one of the best and most creative play callers in the league. He has Michael Pittman Jr. as a big Z. He has Adonai Mitchell to be a vertical X. Josh Downs is a great slot receiver. He did just have an ankle sprain, I believe, so we do have to see about that. His tight end room is fine, but he has stud running back Jonathan Taylor and a very, very good offensive line. Overall, it's a fantastic situation. And another fun fact, if he had played all 17 games, he was on pace for 17 rushing touchdowns, which would have broken the rushing touchdown record just set by Josh Allen and Jaylen Herz at 15. So, once again, we can't predict injuries, and if he is able to stay healthy this season, he absolutely could finish as a QB1 overall. And as a matter of fact, in the 4 games he played, in 2 of those 4 games, he was a top 5 quarterback, and in one of the other 2 games, he only played about a third of the snaps but finished with over 17 fantasy points. Now, is this guy the best real-life quarterback? No. But he's in a wonderful situation with potentially the most rushing upside of anyone in the NFL. And if he's able to stay healthy, it shouldn't shock anybody if he's the QB1 overall and by a large margin. So at QB4, I have Lamar Jackson of the Baltimore Ravens. He finished as the QB4 this past season with the 3rd most fantasy points per game at the quarterback position. So throughout his career, he's finished with the 34th in his rookie year, 1st, 8th, 7th, 6th, and 3rd most fantasy points per game among quarterbacks. This guy's absolutely a threat for 1,000 rushing yards, and the rushing floor and ceiling is what allows most of these quarterbacks in this tier and the previous tier to be in these tiers. There's an unparalleled ceiling that just cannot be provided by somebody that just doesn't have any rushing upside. And so with Lamar Jackson, his situation is essentially the exact same. Although they did sign Derrick Henry in free agency, I do think he's going to vulture a lot of touchdowns, but it's going to allow the offense to be much more efficient and scary, and it is going to open up things in the passing game. He still has Mark Andrews at tight end. He has Zay Flowers at receiver. We'll see if Rashad Bateman does anything. It's a make-or-break year for him. Isaiah Likely's a good tight end. So overall, he has a fantastic situation around him, and he's going to be a mainstay in the top 5 or right around there until he is just too old to really provide the rushing upside anymore. So at QB3, I have Pat Mahomes of the Kansas City Chiefs at 6'2", 225, and 28.9 years old. He's been a mainstay among the top 5 in general for the quarterback position, and throughout his career, in his 2nd year, he had the 1st most fantasy points per game, then 6th, 2nd, 5th, 2nd, and 10th. Now, Hollywood Brown, they did sign. He does have an injury, so we'll have to see about his timeline. But they drafted the fastest wide receiver ever at the 40-yard dash in Xavier Worthy. They still have Travis Kelce, who's still a very, very elite tight end, even though he is slightly declining. They have Rashee Rice to man the slot. They still have Isaiah Pacheco at the running back position, so it should be a very good offense overall. And he is probably the most talented real-life quarterback. He isn't my first quarterback overall in these rankings, but it shouldn't shock anybody if he finishes as the QB1 overall. He doesn't have some of the rushing upside that some of these other guys do, but he's such a better passer and more efficient than most of these guys in terms of his ability to keep the offense going and be efficient in the red zone, that he absolutely deserves this spot. And we should expect a bounce-back season for Patrick Mahomes because his QB8 finish was uncharacteristic for him. At QB2, I have Jaylen Herz of the Philadelphia Eagles. He's 6'1", 222 pounds, and he's 26 years old. He has one of the better situations around him. He has one of the best offensive lines in the NFL. Jason Kelce did retire, so that is going to hurt a little bit. The tush-push probably isn't going to be what it once was. They may not even run it. But he did just break the rushing touchdown record, and he tied it with our number 1 quarterback, Josh Allen, at 15. So he does provide massive rushing upside. And the past 3 seasons, he's finished as the QB 6, 1, and 2 in fantasy points per game. And his situation, besides Jason Kelce retiring, isn't any different. He still has star wide receiver A.J. Brown to play X, star wide receiver Devontae Smith to be their Z receiver. He's one of the better number 2 options in the league. Dallas Goedert's a fine tight end. They did, however, sign Saquon Barkley, so I think that is going to hurt his rushing touchdown potential, but the offense also should be much more efficient and high scoring, so that could offset somewhat, and he's still one of the better fantasy quarterbacks in fantasy football with a tremendous ceiling and a very safe floor. So my QB1 is Josh Allen of the Buffalo Bills at 6'5", 237 pounds, and 28.2 years old. He's a freight train. He is a walking rushing touchdown. As I said a minute ago, he and Jaylen Herz tied the rushing touchdown record for a quarterback with 15 this past season. As I said just a minute ago, he and Jaylen Herz both broke the rushing touchdown record for quarterbacks with 15 in a season. He's been the QB1 in 3 of the past 4 seasons, and now while they did lose Stefon Diggs, he provides you with a very safe floor of about 600 yards and 7 touchdowns or so per season, with a very, very high weekly floor and amazing ceiling. He should have multiple 40-point games this season, shouldn't shock anybody. And just like I said earlier, even though they lost Stefon Diggs, they still have Dalton Kincaid. I do think they're going to misuse Keon Coleman. I don't think he's going to be a good fit at X for them. But Khalil Shakir and Curtis Samuel are fine options. They still have James Cook in the backfield. Now, they did draft Ray Davis, so I do think that may hurt Josh Allen's rushing touchdown output just a little bit, or at least limit his ceiling. But like I said earlier, he's been the QB1 3 of the past 4 seasons, and until he's not the QB1, I'm going to treat him as the QB1. So there you have it. Those are my 2024 fantasy football rankings for the quarterback position. What do you think? Do you agree with my rankings? Do you see something that you disagree with? Please let me know in the comment section below. I am going to have running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends out this week, so stay tuned for those. With that being said, I'm the Fantasy Football Strategist, your NFL breaking news source, and the Dynasty and redraft implications behind said breaking news. I am building a library of information with which you can use to dominate your redraft and Dynasty leagues in 2024 and beyond. Please remember to like and subscribe. It would mean the absolute world to me. Thank you and have a good day.